Hey, are you even listening, you idiot? The sharp voice cut through the quiet murmur of the cafe like a slap. Heads turned, but most customers quickly looked away, pretending they didn't hear it. No one wanted to get involved. Behind the counter, Daniel, a young man with Down syndrome, flinched but didn't react. He had been trained to stay calm, to smile no matter what. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to process the angry man's words. The customer, a tall man in his early 40s, wearing a sharp suit and a Rolex, slammed his hand against the counter. Martin Keller, a name that carried weight in the corporate world. He was a hedge fund manager, used to snapping his fingers and getting instant results. And right now he was furious. "This is the third time I've asked for my order," he spat. "How hard is it to do your damn job?" Daniel's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came out. He had always been a little slower with speech, and when he got nervous, it got worse. He opened the register, double-checking the order on the screen. His heart pounded in his chest. "Just say something, for God's sake," Martin barked, throwing up his hands. He turned to the cafe manager, who had just rushed over. "Why is this person working here? He's clearly not capable." Daniel felt the heat rise in his face, but he didn't cry. Not here. Not in front of so many people. He just wanted to do his job like everyone else. The manager, a nervous man in his late 50s, tried to intervene. "Sir, please, let's keep it respectful. I don't need a lecture. I need my damn coffee. Get someone else to serve me. This is a waste of my time." A thick silence settled over the cafe. Customers stole glances but said nothing. A few awkwardly sipped their lattes, hoping it would all be over soon. The staff froze, waiting for someone to defuse the situation. And then, from the corner of the cafe, a deep voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You really think that's how you should treat people?" The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Calm. Unshaken. Familiar. Martin turned, his frustration spilling over. "Yeah. And who the hell are?" His breath caught in his throat. Because standing there, holding a paper cup and watching everything unfold, was Tom Cruise. The room shifted in an instant. People who had been avoiding eye contact suddenly sat up straighter. A couple of teenagers whispered excitedly, eyes wide. Even the cafe manager looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. Martin blinked, still processing. His mouth opened then closed again. And Daniel? He still didn't understand why everyone had gone silent. He was too busy keeping his hands steady, trying to do his job. But he did notice something. For the first time since the man had started yelling, he wasn't scared anymore. For a moment nobody moved. The air inside the cafe felt thick, charged with something unspoken. Martin Keller blinked, his frustration momentarily stunned into silence. His eyes darted back and forth between Daniel, the trembling young employee, and the man who had just spoken. Tom Cruise. It couldn't be. Not here. Not in this little coffee shop. Martin forced a chuckle, trying to brush off his sudden wave of discomfort. Maybe he had just imagined it. Maybe this was just some guy who looked like. Then Tom took a slow sip of his coffee, watching him over the rim of the cup. His expression? Completely unreadable. The realization hit Martin like a truck. It really was him. The cafe was still dead silent. But suddenly, Martin could feel the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on him. Customers who had been ignoring the argument now seemed glued to their seats. Some even had their phones half-raised, recording. His stomach twisted. Damn it. But instead of backing down, he did what he always did, pushed harder. "You know what?" Martin scoffed, shifting his weight onto one foot, trying to regain control. "I don't really care who's watching. This is about basic competence." He jabbed a finger toward Daniel, who had gone pale behind the register. "This guy's slow. He's messing up orders. That's not my fault." A faint murmur rippled through the room, but no one spoke up. Daniel, meanwhile, was shrinking. He wanted to disappear. He could feel the sweat on his palms, his heartbeat slamming against his ribcage. Why did this always happen? He had been working at this cafe for almost a year. Most days were good. Some were great. But then, once in a while, someone like this walked in. Someone who saw only his disability, not his effort. Not how hard he tried. Not the fact that he wanted to be here to belong. Just this. The embarrassment clawed up his throat, but he swallowed it down. He had learned not to cry at work. Still, he could feel his hands betraying him. Shaking. Not because he was scared anymore, but because his body just did that sometimes. The tremors always got worse when he was anxious. He fumbled for the register, trying to check the order again. If he could just fix this. If he could just do something right. Crash. Daniel flinched as Martin slammed his coffee cup onto the counter. The lid popped off, and dark liquid sloshed onto the surface, dripping onto the floor. Oh, this is what I mean. Martin threw up his hands. I swear, I don't have time for this. The cafe manager rushed forward again, flustered. Sir, please. Please what? Martin cut him off, his voice getting louder. I'm a paying customer. I expect competence. But instead I get. His hand gestured vaguely toward Daniel. Like he wasn't even a person. The cafe felt suffocating. Daniel's breath came out shallow, his fingers gripping the counter's edge. He could feel the stairs now, burning into his skin. And then he heard it. A chair scraping against the floor. A slow, deliberate movement. Daniel's head jerked up, just in time to see Tom Cruise setting his coffee down. Then calmly, methodically he stood up. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Martin Keller looked nervous. Daniel felt his stomach twist as the cafe went silent. It wasn't just the angry man anymore. It was the whispers, the stares, the awkward shuffling of feet. Martin stood there, still fuming, still motioning toward Daniel like he was an inconvenience rather than a person. His voice wasn't even the worst part anymore. It was the fact that nobody stopped him. A woman near the espresso machines leaned into her friend and muttered, "Honestly, I kind of get it. This place is slow sometimes." Another man near the pastry case sighed and checked his watch, his lips pressed into a tight line. A teenage girl giggled under her breath. Not because she thought it was funny, but because uncomfortable people laugh when they don't know what else to do. Daniel felt the weight of their gazes pressing down on him. He shouldn't care. He shouldn't. But he did. He always did. His hands trembled as he tried, one last time, to fix the order. Maybe if he got this right it would be over. Maybe if he could just hand over the coffee and say, "Here, sir. Have a great day." Martin would take his overpriced drink and walk away. But the numbers on the register were swimming. His fingers wouldn't work. He couldn't breathe. The familiar feeling of panic coiled in his chest like a vice. He thought about leaving. He could just unclip his name tag, walk into the back room, and tell his manager he wasn't feeling well. He could grab his coat and go home. No one would stop him. They'd probably be relieved. Then he wouldn't have to hear the whispers anymore. The impatient sighs. The awkward shuffling of customers who didn't want to be part of this, but also didn't care enough to stop it. Unbelievable. Martin muttered under his breath, shaking his head. I should have gone to Starbucks. Daniel's fingers curled into his palm. Just breathe. Just breathe. He tried to tell himself it wasn't that bad. He'd been through worse. Hadn't he? His mind flashed back to the job interview. How his manager had smiled so warmly, shaking his hand. We're an inclusive workplace, Daniel. You're welcome here. How proud he had been when they gave him his uniform. When he memorized the menu. When he started getting faster, better. He had fought so hard for this. For his right to stand here. For his right to belong. But now he was shaking behind a register, humiliated, while a stranger picked apart his existence in front of an entire room of people. Maybe he didn't belong here. Maybe he never did. He stared at the crumpled receipt in his hand, blinking fast to stop the burn in his eyes. And then, a voice cut through the tension. You done? It wasn't loud, but it was enough to freeze Martin in place. Tom Cruise was still standing by his table, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other resting casually on the rim of his coffee cup. His face was unreadable, his voice even steady, not angry, not amused, just watching. The room went so quiet that Daniel could hear the hum of the espresso machine. Martin scoffed, shifting his weight. Excuse me. Tom took a slow step forward. Are you done? Martin forced a laugh. I don't know what game you're playing, but this doesn't concern you. Tom tilted his head slightly, eyes locked onto Martin. You sure about that? Martin opened his mouth, then shut it. Because now, people were watching for real. Not just stolen glances or awkward side eyes. Full attention. Daniel felt the shift in the room. the way the tension changed. But he wasn't sure if it was for him, or because of what was about to happen next. The cafe felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. Daniel stood frozen behind the counter, his hands trembling, his breathing shallow. His entire body felt like it was locking up, like his brain was begging him to escape. He could hear the whispers. Is he okay? I mean, the guy has a point. This is so awkward. Someone should just take over his shift. The humiliation had fully set in now. It wasn't just Martin anymore. It was everyone. They weren't helping. They weren't stopping it. They were just watching. Daniel clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. He wasn't supposed to react. That's what his mother had always told him. People can be cruel, sweetheart. But you are strong. You just have to be stronger than them. But right now he didn't feel strong. He felt small. Martin sighed dramatically, rubbing his temples. I swear, it's like talking to a brick wall. He turned toward the cafe manager. Seriously, get someone else. This is ridiculous. The manager hesitated. His mouth opened like he wanted to defend Daniel, but then his eyes flicked toward the long line of customers, impatient and watching. And that was it. That single hesitation? That split second of silence? That's when Daniel knew. The manager wasn't going to stand up for him. No one was. A sharp sting built in his chest, something dangerously close to heartbreak. Daniel turned his head down, trying to focus on the register. If he could just keep moving, if he could just pretend none of this was happening. And then something shifted. A new kind of whisper started to ripple through the cafe. At first, Daniel thought it was just more customers talking about him. But then he caught a few words. Wait, is that? Oh my God, I think that's. No way. What is he doing here? Daniel blinked, confused. Even Martin noticed it. His frustration flickered into mild curiosity. He turned slightly, trying to see what everyone was whispering about. And that's when Daniel finally noticed. A few of the bank employees from next door, men and women in crisp suits and polished shoes, were standing near the entrance. They weren't just ordering coffee. They were staring at something. And they looked nervous. Daniel followed their gaze, his stomach twisting. What were they looking at? And then, a voice cut through the murmurs. Calm, controlled, but unmistakably firm. I'm just curious, is this how you talk to people who serve you? Silence. Martin turned fully now, and as soon as his eyes landed on the speaker, his entire expression changed. The annoyance was gone, replaced with something else. Shock. Recognition. And for the first time since this whole thing started, uncertainty. Because standing a few feet away, looking at him with an unreadable expression, was Tom Cruise. The whispers turned into full murmurs of excitement and disbelief. Martin's lips parted, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just realized he walked straight into traffic. Tom took a slow sip of his coffee, waiting, and then he spoke again. I asked you a question. His voice was still calm, still measured, but something about it made the entire room hold its breath. Martin swallowed hard. I wasn't. But Tom didn't blink. Didn't move. Just stared. And in that moment, Daniel realized something. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, Martin Keller looked afraid. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Martin Keller didn't know what to say. The cafe, once filled with impatient murmurs and clinking cups, was now silent. Every single person was watching. And at the center of it all, standing with an air of effortless confidence, was Tom Cruise. He wasn't frowning. He wasn't scolding. He was simply waiting, like a man giving someone just enough rope to hang themselves. Martin let out a short, awkward laugh, shaking his head as if this was all some ridiculous misunderstanding. Look, this isn't what it looks like. Tom raised an eyebrow. Isn't it? Martin scoffed, running a hand through his slick back hair. Come on. I was just trying to get my coffee. This kid, he gestured toward Daniel without looking at him, was taking forever. And I've got places to be. The moment the words left his mouth, he realized his mistake. Because now, people weren't just watching. They were reacting. A middle-aged woman near the counter shook her head in disapproval. A man near the window crossed his arms, his expression hardening. Even the barista behind the espresso machine, who had previously been avoiding eye contact, stopped pretending to work. Tom tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. So, let me get this straight, he said, his voice still maddeningly calm. You were in a hurry. So you thought yelling at someone was the best way to handle it? Martin let out another nervous chuckle. It wasn't like that. Tom took a slow step forward. No. Martin swallowed. No, Tom nodded, considering that. Then, in the same steady voice, he asked, would you have spoken to him that way if he didn't have Down syndrome? The question landed like a thunderclap. The tension in the cafe shifted. Daniel felt it. The customers felt it. Even the manager, who had spent the last few minutes pretending this wasn't happening, finally looked uncomfortable. Martin's jaw tightened. That's not. Tom didn't let him finish. Because from where I'm standing, it sure looked like you singled him out. Martin's face flushed red. I didn't single him out. I just expect competence when I'm paying for something. A few customers muttered under their breath. Someone near the door whispered, jerk. Tom let the words hang for a moment before responding. You know, I've worked with some of the best stunt coordinators, pilots, and athletes in the world. And you know what the best ones all have in common? Martin crossed his arms, his irritation creeping back in. I'm sure you're gonna tell me. Tom ignored the sarcasm. Patience. He let that word settle. Because real skill, it isn't just about doing things fast. It's about doing them right. He turned slightly, addressing the entire cafe now. And from what I saw, Daniel here was trying to do his job. You just didn't give him the chance. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Because for the first time, someone had said his name. Not this guy. Not him. Not the kid. Daniel. And that changed everything. Martin scoffed again. But it wasn't as confident this time. Oh please. Are you really turning this into some inspirational moment? He glanced around, his eyes darting between the customers. You're all acting like I committed some crime. I was just, his voice faltered. Because the room had changed. Customers who had previously looked disinterested were now glaring at him. Some had their arms crossed. Others whispered in disapproval. A woman in a business suit shook her head, murmuring something to the person next to her. Even the cafe manager, who had been hesitant to intervene, cleared his throat and took a step closer to Daniel. Martin's smirk disappeared. The power was slipping from his grasp, and for the first time he knew it. And then Tom took one final step forward, closing the distance between them. Not threatening, not aggressive, just undeniably present. And in a voice so calm it was terrifying, he asked, Are you done? Martin swallowed hard. Because this time, he didn't have an answer. Martin opened his mouth, searching for a way out, a way to reclaim the control that had slipped through his fingers. But there was nothing. No clever excuse. No condescending remark. No power left in his voice. The weight of the room had shifted entirely. The silence stretched on, suffocating. His eyes darted around, looking for anyone who might still be on his side. But all he found were crossed arms, narrowed eyes, and quiet disapproval. Even the people who had earlier whispered in agreement now looked embarrassed, as if they didn't want to be associated with him. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. He gave a forced laugh, weak and unconvincing. This is ridiculous. Are we really making a big deal out of this? No one laughed. No one spoke. Not even the manager. Martin exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. His frustration was now thinly veiled humiliation. He muttered under his breath, I don't need this. With a huff he turned to leave, grabbing his wallet from the counter. He moved quickly, trying to make it to the door before. You forgot something. Tom's voice stopped him cold. Martin hesitated, but he didn't turn around. What? Tom's footsteps were slow, measured. An apology. Martin stiffened. His jaw clenched. I don't know. You do. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a fact. And the entire cafe was waiting. Martin stood frozen, his hand still gripping his wallet, his breath tight in his chest. And for the first time in his life he had no choice. He had lost. His lips pressed into a tight line before he muttered, barely above a whisper, I'm sorry. But it wasn't for Daniel. It was for himself. For the humiliation. For the public shame. Not for what he did. Not for who he hurt. But Tom wasn't done. That's not for me, Tom said. His voice was steady, but there was something undeniably firm beneath it. Say it to him. Martin turned slowly, his face a mix of resentment and resignation. His gaze landed on Daniel, who was still standing behind the register, stunned. For a moment, Martin said nothing. And then in a clipped, hollow tone he muttered, "I'm sorry." Daniel's chest tightened. For so long, he had been on the receiving end of whispers, stares, and words that made him feel less than. And now the world had flipped. The powerful man in the suit wasn't powerful anymore. Daniel wasn't small anymore. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't nothing. Tom gave a slight nod, satisfied. That's better. Martin turned without another word and stormed out, pushing the cafe door open with unnecessary force. The moment it shut behind him, the tension in the air dissolved. And Daniel, for the first time in a long time, he could breathe again. The door swung shut behind Martin, rattling the glass. For a moment no one spoke. No one moved. The tension he had left behind still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Then finally, a quiet exhale. Daniel wasn't sure if it had come from him or someone else, but it was like the entire cafe had taken a breath together. The weight on his chest eased, but his hands still trembled slightly. The adrenaline wasn't gone yet. His mind kept replaying the past few minutes, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Martin Keller, the powerful, well-dressed, important man, had left the cafe in shame. And him? The one who had always been looked down on, dismissed, ignored? He was still standing. He wasn't invisible anymore. A soft murmur rippled through the cafe as people started talking again. Not about him, but about what they had just witnessed. That was insane. Did that really just happen? Tom Cruise just called that guy out in front of everyone. Daniel's manager approached cautiously, still looking rattled. Hey, Daniel, are you all right? He nodded, even though he wasn't sure how he felt yet. His emotions were still catching up. The manager sighed. Look, I should have stepped in sooner. Before he could finish, the cafe doors swung open again. Everyone turned. For a second Daniel thought. Feared. That Martin had come back. That he wasn't done. But it wasn't him. It was one of the bank employees from next door. A tall woman in a navy blue blazer. Her heels clicking against the floor as she made a beeline for the counter. She didn't even look at the menu. Excuse me, she said, addressing the manager directly. Was that man just now Martin Keller? The manager hesitated. Yeah. Her lips pressed into a tight line. I thought so. He's one of our clients. Or, she adjusted her bag over her shoulder, was. Daniel's eyes widened. The woman pulled out her phone, typing something rapidly. I need to make a call. But I can tell you right now, if this is how he treats people in public, we're about to take a very close look at how he does business. And just like that, she was gone. The door swung shut behind her. A new kind of hush settled over the cafe. This wasn't the awkward, tense silence from before. It was something heavier. Something that carried real weight. Martin Keller wasn't just embarrassed. He was about to lose more than his pride. The realization made Daniel's stomach flip. He had never wanted revenge. He had never wanted any of this. But now he was seeing something he had never seen before. Consequences. For once, the person who had made him feel small wasn't just walking away untouched. The cafe gradually returned to normal. Orders were called out. Machines hissed and whirred. The background chatter resumed, but there was still an energy in the air. Like everyone had just witnessed something they wouldn't forget. Daniel, however, was still standing behind the register, staring at his hands. They were still shaking, but not from fear anymore. It was like his body understood the moment before his mind did. Then a voice, gentler this time. Hey kid. Daniel blinked, looking up. Tom Cruise was standing across the counter, still holding his now cold coffee. For the first time since he had stepped in, his expression softened. You okay? Daniel swallowed. His throat was dry. He wasn't sure how to answer. Tom must have seen the hesitation because he nodded slightly, a silent way of saying, take your time. Daniel exhaled slowly. I think so. Tom tilted his head. That was rough. It wasn't a question. Daniel gave a small, tired smile. Yeah. A pause. Then, Tom set his coffee down. Not to leave. Not because he was in a rush, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, Someone had stopped to just talk to him. Really talk to him. People like that? Tom said, leaning on the counter slightly. They always think they're bigger than everyone else. But you? You stood your ground. Daniel hesitated. I didn't really do anything. Tom shook his head. You didn't back down. Even when you could have walked away. Daniel hadn't thought of it that way. Tom smiled a little. You know, that's what makes you stronger than him. The words landed somewhere deep inside Daniel's chest, in a place he had long buried. For years, he had been told to keep his head down, to not make a scene, to let things go. But today he didn't disappear. And that changed everything. The cafe had gone back to its usual rhythm. Orders being called out, coffee machines hissing, quiet conversations filling the air. But for Daniel, everything had changed. He wasn't just standing behind the counter anymore. He was standing in his own power. Tom Cruise picked up his now cold coffee, giving Daniel a small nod. You're a good kid, he said. Keep being you. Daniel opened his mouth, wanting to say something, anything, to express the overwhelming mix of emotions swelling in his chest. But before he could find the words, Tom had already turned toward the door, slipping on his sunglasses, as if this was just another ordinary day for him. The cafe was still watching. Everyone had seen what happened. But Daniel no longer felt like they were staring at him. They were just seeing him. For the first time he felt like he belonged. And then the real test. A new customer stepped up to the counter. A man in his 60s with a kind face. He smiled at Daniel. Hey there. How's your day going? Daniel hesitated. He could still feel the weight of what had just happened lingering inside him. A storm that hadn't fully settled. But when he looked into the man's eyes, something clicked. He had a choice. He could let what happened define him, or he could decide who he was going to be moving forward. So he took a breath, steadied himself and smiled. It's a good day, he said. And for the first time he meant it. The man nodded. That's great to hear. Then he pointed at the menu. I'll take a large coffee, please. Daniel's hands moved to the register. No shaking. No fear. Just him doing his job. And as he handed the man his receipt, he finally found the words he had been searching for. Thank you, he said. Not just to the man, not just to Tom Cruise, but to himself. Because today, he had learned something that no one could take away from him. Strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like standing your ground when no one else will. And if someone like Martin Keller ever came back through those doors, Daniel knew exactly what he'd do. He'd look them in the eye, stand tall, and keep going. Because he wasn't small. Not anymore.